So like Lori said, this really is just like a scratch the surface. It's probably going to be more useful for the people watching the videos. So if you don't have much experience, how do you set up, how do you run tests to get like clean, good information? And then why would you select certain tests to, why would you do a counter movement jump over a squat jump or a squat jump over a drop jump? Some decision making there. And then we'll actually do a quick demo and maybe talk our way through some of the curves, just to kind of have a good understanding of what you're looking at. And then we'll kind of move on. So the history, what's a force plate? It's just a system that measures the force applied, a fancy bathroom scale. So it typically measures somewhere between 500 and 1,000 times a second, also known as a hertz. So if you do a 60-second test, something like 4 counter movement jumps, you've got something in the vicinity of 60,000 Excel spreadsheet cells. So it kind of goes into the history. Why were they sort of confined to the biomech labs? They were expensive. You had to embed them in floors. The signal and noise had to be sort of funneled out so you could actually read the thing. You can see it's been used in everything from automotive testing to gait cycles in dogs. And then you can see sort of the more athletic image, but the plate's embedded. There's markers on the athlete. And it just took a long time to set up, and then it took a long time to process the data. So here, like I was saying, 60,000 cells or so for 4 jumps. Not very user-friendly. It's not like you could just go test someone and then walk out onto the field and have it implement your program. The slide above, or the picture above, is actually Philip Graham-Smith's, one of Dr. Phil, his actual spreadsheet that was one of the beginnings of ForceDex. So he would go through, he'd write all the equations, so find displacement, find velocity, find it in the, I think he would do it in the X and Y and Z, is that right? So he would do it for everything. So you're talking about multiple equations, then you break it up into phases, then you find force at given time points, and then you find powers. And so you have to take that information and funnel it through that sort of, I don't want to call it a code because now you can write code, but equations. So it was very time consuming. So the question is, was it actionable? Was preseason data that was taken maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and then you test again, was that actually something you could use? Or was it more just sort of like a historical look at what people were and now where they are now? There was no interventions based on the information you were getting in time to matter. So why are force plates sort of on the rise in popularity? The basic reasons are cost. So what used to be one single force plate embedded in the ground, the amp, digital analog converter, probably cost you the same as maybe all 3 of these platforms, dual platforms with software that does all those calculations for you. So cost has come down, efficiency has gone up, the ease of use has gone up because now you just click a button to hit analyze and all those equations are done for you. You can now move with the platforms. So if you have maybe a big university or a multi, I don't know what you want to call it, a baseball team with multi-organizations in the same sort of umbrella, you can now pick the platforms up, go to the next sort of affiliate and do your testing there. And then the quality of data is still very high. So then the question is, why are people using force plates? If we know like how come it's on the rise, there's 3 major buckets that all fall under sort of this objective kinetic data. So the first major bucket would be, it helps inform your rehab or your return to sport. That may be semantics in terms of returning to a sport rather than just returning to life. And then also the post-return to sport. So how can it improve your ongoing monitoring of somebody who's been injured maybe 2 years ago to keep an eye on them as they move through time? The second big bucket would be performance profiling. We could also throw in asymmetry profiling into that bucket. And that's just sort of like, you could call it maybe like a jump or neuromuscular signature. So who is the person standing in front of you? How do they perform their eccentric phase, concentric phase? What do they look like asymmetrically when they're healthy, what changes under fatigue, does anything change? And then the last bucket would be the fatigue and load monitoring. So when you perform 3 days of intense work and travel, how does that affect someone's, I don't know what you want to call it, adaptability, readiness, fatigue? And then you can start saying it can be work in small settings, so like one-on-one biofeedback, very sort of acute changes to a program, or it can be just a big global team environment to make broad sweeping sort of decisions based on like global load management. And so this is just a paper from Gabbett. It says team strength and conditioning staff should implement more objective assessments of the player's physical capacity and readiness to play, and we should move towards assessing the outcome of training. So what's actually taking place on an individual level, instead of taking sort of like a theoretical construct and saying, well, theoretically all of our players should move this way with this type of training, and instead looking at how each individual player changes with those same sort of loading patterns. Okay, so the big sort of big deal with kinetic data, the objective value, is to move away from sort of purely outcome-based tests. How far do you hop? How high do you jump? How much do you lift? And there's more value in how you get those. So how do you jump high? How do you lift a heavy weight? How do you hop for distance? Or the strategy involved, the eccentric phase, concentric phase, and landing. If protocols are done well, so if your testing is set up and executed well, the data is very valid and reliable. And it's data that you can't just sit there and see. So you can't, it's not very easy to say, well, this person produces this much force in the eccentric phase, and I see this asymmetry during a ballistic activity. So it's stuff that you can't watch and manage. So it's a nice tool to help sort of underpin maybe decisions you're making in your program currently. And it may not revolutionize things, but it may nudge you in certain directions sooner or with maybe more clarity than without it. Isometric testing can open up some new doors into both training and monitoring. So while isometrics have been around for a long time, if I tell you to push into me as hard as you can and I just say, yeah, you feel stronger. So like, it's a common PT test. I hurt my shoulder, I'm gonna push, and you're gonna go, okay, that feels stronger than last week, but now we can objectively quantify it and say you've progressed X amount, your rate of force development has progressed X amount, and you're 30% away from where you were before you were hurt. So we can have like a much more in-depth conversation and a clear conversation, both from practitioner to athlete and from practitioner to practitioner. So what Lori said earlier, from PT or medical to strength staff, from strength staff to sport coach, there's a much clearer dialogue. And then see the entire strategy. So like I was saying, eccentric is tough to measure, especially in a ballistic. We've got the NORD board for Supermax slow eccentrics. And we have IKDs, isokinetic dynamometers, but the feasibility, the cost makes it a very difficult thing to implement. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of briefly touch on some of those big buckets. Like we said, the talk is very sort of superficial, so I think other presenters are going to go more in depth. But if we look at the return to sport, it's more than how high you jump. So what the graph is showing is, if you can see this first column, this is pre and post ACL in quad strength, and the max strength or peak force is nearly returned to normal. But if you look at early stage, rate of force development, and then particularly early stage rate of force development, 6 months post-injury, there's still a drastic lag in how they do things. Again, not something you can easily quantify, but with a force plate, it becomes highly actionable and highly visible. This same sort of outcome would be seeable in the eccentric phase. So eccentric qualities tend to be more sensitive and more volatile post-injury. And then the common saying is that elite athletes are elite compensators. It's probably semantics, but I'd say they're elite solutions, like they're problem solvers. So they figure out how to achieve an outcome regardless of how they do it. even if it's to their own detriment in the long term. So to keep to grip on that and maybe have a conversation with them or with the training staff is very nice. I had it's just a play on the old Charlie Francis quote, what looks right flies right. What flies right may not look right. So the way they achieve their outcome isn't necessarily a return to how they achieve those outcomes. So just a way to look at it. So force velocity, performance profiling. I know Ramsey's going to talk about this later. So we have force velocity profiling for sports, for specific groups, for positions, for an athlete in and of themselves. I think one of the cool things about having something like a force plate is you can take it from a group mean now into an individual level or create a positional specific measure that you're going to compare people against. You have the freedom now, instead of to just kind of do a big, well-rounded assessment, to really dive in while doing still the large assessment. We can do things like the dynamic strength index. For those not familiar, it's the peak force in a CMJ divided by or in relation to the peak force in an isometric mid-thigh pull. So the idea is in that chart down below that if you have a low DSI, so something below 60%, you're going to train ballistic strength to improve your outcomes. If you're somewhere between 60 and 80, you train concurrently. And if you're above 80%, you train more maximal strength. Now the caveat, and the reason I put Daniel's quadrants up there, is that ratios lose sight of high, and low. So if I produce 60 newtons and 100 newtons in a counter movement jump versus someone who produces 600,000 and a million, it's the same ratio, but they're very different people. So while the ratio is nice and it can push you somewhere, you just have to keep in mind that the same ratio could be a very different animal. Same thing with the eccentric utilization ratio. So it's sort of like an effectiveness of stretch shorten cycle usage. So if you jump very close to the same height with a squat jump as you do counter movement jump, it would nudge you to believe that the utilization of your stretch shorten function isn't that great. Whereas if you have a huge discrepancy, there may be more force generating capacity you can improve. The performance profiling, then we can go just kind of an overall eccentric, concentric, and power capabilities. What can someone do? How do they do it? And how does that shift through time? And then the asymmetry profiling. I'm looking forward to Dr. Cohen's talk because asymmetries for me are a tricky one. If you've got a right-sided wide receiver and they show a right-sided asymmetry, is it a functional thing or is it a problem? Do they run down the field, plant off their right foot, and turn to the middle of the field for the last 15 years of their life, and that's just who they are? Does it fit with context of injury history or nagging signs of pain or discomfort, or shifts? What's the important part with asymmetries? And the last bucket is fatigue or load monitoring. So lots of the same tests, just new data points that may open windows to earlier detection. So we have a little chart on the bottom that shows an increase in jump height, but a substantial lengthening of the eccentric duration. So that could be a strategy under fatigue where someone takes a much longer time to produce the same outcome. So regardless if you were testing jump height or not, you would get that same info, but the force plate helps you see possibly that strategy or the underlying qualities of how the athlete is achieving those outputs. And then again, so the monitoring stuff can also fall under asymmetry. So post-injury, if you do a repeated test, do you see an asymmetrical fatigue, maybe with an injured limb or an uninjured limb as someone goes through what might be multiple isometrics, multiple jump test. And then the protocol. So like what are people doing with force plates? So we've already touched on some. The counter movement jump, I put plyo push-up in there because it's a possibility, but there's some issues we'll talk about. You've got multiple isometric options, single limbs, bilateral, upper body, squat jumps, drop jumps, single leg jumps, hop tests, and land and holds. So counter movement jump. You're gonna have to forgive me for my jump, but little, sort of like a phase breakdown of a jump. It's kind of like your core test. It's like if you're gonna get force plates, you're probably starting, unless someone's hurt, you're probably gonna be testing a counter movement jump. The reason being is it gives you all three phases, gives you some eccentric data, some concentric data, landing data, and then it gives you asymmetries for all three of those phases as well. So some of this stuff, again, this is gonna start to probably be a lot of review for you, but when testing a counter movement jump, we're just gonna talk a little bit about the protocol. So you set the force plates up, you want a nice level ground. This actually isn't that bad. Firm, you're gonna zero platforms, and then you're gonna weigh the athlete. I think one of the biggest mistakes newer users make is that they don't take accurate body weights. And the reason that's important is it's gonna affect like a host of variables from your durations and start of movement to relative force values to power values and displacement. So not taking a good athlete weight is setting your data up to potentially have a wide range of variability that doesn't need to be there. And then the steady period. So having nice clean breaks between jumps and a nice steady period and someone not moving around, sort of bouncing, is gonna level out that force curve and again, allow you to get accurate starts of movement, which affects those durations. And then the cueing. So if you're coaching these things, you're not just throwing force plates on the ground and acting like your job's done and just do some jumps and walk away. It's no different than cueing a max squat or a 40-yard dash. There's as much intent and focus and technique into performing a jump test as there is any of those other tests. I know Daniel will talk more about that, the technical model testing model, so I'm not gonna beat that horse. And then from here, you're gonna build out other testing options. So you're kind of starting with the counter movement jump, and then depending on maybe positions athletes play, maybe the size of the athlete, maybe the training history, maybe the injury history, we'll start to maybe bucket out different testing options after the counter movement jump. So one of those buckets will be isometrics. So this could be maybe someone with a chronic issue with a hamstring or an Achilles, or someone coming back from an injury, or it could be max strength testing with an isometric mid-thigh pull. Could be shoulders. And so again, another big one here is people don't weigh the limb. So now if you're gonna sit here like this picture with the ASH test, if you get in position and lay your limb on the force plate, you wanna take the weight of that limb so that start of movement and your force values are accurate. You also wanna be nice and steady, and then you want a small pre-tension, so just a little bit of pressure into the plate before you slam on the gas. And the reason is, if we look at this green curve, it's a nice sort of tabletop curve. What we don't want to see is something that goes up sharply, bounces back down, and then sort of reverts back up. And the problem with that, there's a few, but one of the biggest ones is if we achieve peak after that rebound, that time discrepancy is going to affect your rate of force development, sort of volatility or variation. And then maximal intent. So just like the jump, you've got to push and push hard. So hard and fast, keep pressure. And you've got to coach athletes to actually give you maximal effort so that the data is actually a valid test of what someone can do and not just cruising through the motions. And then the isometrics, the DSI, which we talked about. So if you've done the counter movement jump and you add in a mid-thigh pull, you've now got the ability to look at a DSI. So this is kind of what we were just getting at in the injuries. So we've got peak force up here at the top. You've got rate of force development from start of movement to the peak. There's definitely a bunch of stuff on the different time segments and the reliability of each segment. So then you've got 0 to 50 milliseconds, you've got 0 to 100 milliseconds, 150, and then it's kind of like if you go through a training program and you get a shift. So you see that dotted line's a shift in force production. Same peak force, but now at 100, 150 milliseconds, there's additional force generated. So just shifting the curve to a steeper curve has given you more force early on while peak force is identical. So it's an adaptation that you may not see anywhere else. Now we can look at squat jumps. So counter movement jumps, if maybe you're a big defensive or offensive lineman, or you don't want people dropping off a box because you don't think they can handle it, whether it be injuries or positional demands, the squat jump is another option. Again, zero the platforms before the jump, weigh the athlete again. We've already gone over that. And I put a get low. So one of the common things I see quite often is we'll always say a self-selected depth, but if you get a guy who can't, or an athlete I should say, who can't remove the counter movement and you constantly see a little dip, it's probably someone who's starting really, really high and then they're going, okay, I want a little something. So if you see that repetitively, I just tell them to get a little lower. And it's got to be a static start because the whole goal is to remove the stretch shorten cycle, have them sit at that position for a while and get what they can do from a static start. So the RFD becomes a viable option to measure without the counter movement due to the fact that stretch won't increase forces prior to moving into the concentric. And you get that eccentric utilization ratio so that you can pair that with the counter movement jump. So then drop jumps. So this is one where you actually have to weigh the athlete. Since they're not starting on the platforms, there's really no choice. For the data to be have any sort of clarity, you've got to start the test, weigh the athlete, then remove them, put them on the box, and have them do a drop jump. I didn't put you get reactive strength index, so the contact time to jump height. It's more of a fast stretch shorten cycle, whereas this CMJ is going to be a slow stretch shorten cycle. So the reasons why you may implement the drop jump alongside the CMJ is that you have an athlete who's sprinting maybe longer distances, maybe they're exceeding long yardages, so you've got ground contact times that are short, and so you want to see what they can do and you want to measure the progress, whereas those bigger guys who have a smaller area to move in aren't picking up to velocities where ground contact times require you to look at the function. Some issues are box heights. So if you're going to test a team and you've kind of got to choose, am I going to swap boxes in for sort of optimizing someone's drop jump test, so the height of the box, or am I going to sort of save time and choose a one size box fits all and just funnel people through the test and watch progress on that one box height alone? So just like if you're going to do, I would do one or the other, either try and optimize or stick with a box. And then so asymmetries here versus counter movement jump. So since there's no pre-stretch and takeoff, the landing phase in the counter movement jump potentially is influenced by how you load and take off the ground. So if I load left, take off left, potentially physics is just going to have me balance out right, land right. Whereas if I'm just hopping off a box, you're going to see how someone lands without an influence. So there may be a reason to view that. And then the reliability of this test probably hugely depends on someone's history with this test. So drop jumps are difficult to do. To just throw someone in day one and think you're going to get like a real nice, reliable information is probably a bit of a stretch. So there may be a learning curve. You may want to run someone through drop jumps for maybe a couple weeks before you start actively monitoring the information. Okay, so important practices. We've kind of touched on all of this, but the quality data comes from quality protocols. So if you're kind of just mucking about and just sort of wobbling around on the platforms and have highly variable data, the actionability, the ability to look at it and make a decision that's sort of accurate, go further apart. If you're very stringent and perform the test really well, that data becomes more meaningful. The common sources of error, typically it's a platform setup, so the platform isn't flush with the ground isn't stable, the ground is mushy, so this is pretty good, but if it had some give, the sensors would give and you wouldn't pull as good of information. Taking body weight, like that can't be overstated enough, is that taking an accurate body weight is extremely important. Having a good steady period and then the intent. Like you've got to have people attack the jump like they were attacking a 1RM. If you're not eliciting maximal effort, you're not going to get a good result in terms of clarity of what someone can actually do. So I think we're going to run through a few tests. But here's just a good example. So this is a body weight that's 2 kilos off, and we can see how it affects the displacement curve. So the jump on the left is correct, and the one on the right is 2 kilos heavy. So you can see how the displacement cuts in and actually like lands before the person actually lands, and then he actually never comes back to standing up. So you can see just 2 kilos can make a big difference on displacement, which will affect power, which will affect flight times. So you can see that it's just like a clear visual of how that stuff is impactful. But do we have anyone that wants to jump? Yeah, you will. Okay, so I wonder if the dongle is going to work. Let's see. Oh, good God, that didn't record.
I might add as well that we are, for the speakers that can give the slides, we have copies of the slides.
All right, let's see what we get.
So if there is a bunch of text on a slide that you aren't going to want, maybe just note what slide it is, and you can look back at the slide later on. So we're working to get it more printed, but that would just kill the environment. Not everyone's going to want every set of slides, so send that electronically.
All right, come on. These things
Technology.
don't. I know, they don't like new things.
The best and worst part of every day.
There we go. All right. There we go. So what do we got here? So we'll at least go those 2 big guys. I don't know if this is going to work. Does that one have 4 sticks on it? Because if worst case, that it may be the only one that's going to work. For some reason, every time I try and plug these things into something else, it hasn't worked. Come on, man. It found it, and then it just disappeared.
Is it much different between my version and your version, other than blue?
No. That's obnoxious. All right. Get all this. Okay, so which one do we have? That's lights, so we'll go big guys.
Oh, I do.
No. Oh, damn
It
it.
was the wrong way the first time.
It is, always. All right, so we're up there again.
That's just my license to expired.
Is-
There you go. You good?
yeah. Do we have like a test? Let's just. All right. So you want to. Yeah. All right. So we're up and running. For those who've talked to me, this is the old version. You've seen the new version. But if we can watch the force there, if Daniel just kind of shifts, you'll see that stuff shift right, shift left, is it? And then like go ahead and like bounce. Like you can see that just moving about like can get the force to jump or spike. So if you don't have someone stand still, it's very easy to get a high or low weight. So just that 0.1 Newton fluctuation is nice. So he's good. So now like let's do like a slow,
Okay.
and then do like a stiff, and then like a normal.
All right.
So if we start recording and we have him do one jump, perfect. I got 2. And so I'm sure people heard me, but so 3 normal looking jumps, yeah? Like anything stand out to people on the other side of the room that may not have heard me? So if we analyze it, it is just in his strategy. So if we look at the first curve and we take off some characteristic points and we take off acceleration. So we can see like a super flat eccentric, long eccentric phase, that blue portion. Is anyone not familiar with the software? I feel like I'm talking to a bunch of users, but I don't want to assume that. Okay. So can you see the light shaded blue area? So from my cursor to the left here, that's all eccentric phase. And what we're looking at is this velocity is almost nothing. So this would be like someone who jumps without intent. This is just casually going through a jump, and he's stretched out his phase. So eccentric duration, all of your eccentric decel RFD, a lot of variables that other people will start to talk about have just basically been thrown out the window, because what he did on the next jump would show that he's capable of much, much different than what he did. However, what he did here is like a short, stiff jump. So if we looked at displacement, the displacement won't be as deep. So like the way someone jumps has effects on both forces and rates of which those forces are produced. And then the last jump would be his, I guess you call it like your proper counter movement jump. So the idea of showing you this is that if you see data like this, that would probably be a good indication that you need to start coaching the athlete to attack his jump in order for it to be a reliable, repetitive jump. If you see this maybe post-injury, maybe that's a sign that someone's not ready to accept load in the eccentric. It's like an actual strategy. If someone shifted after weeks of jumping like this, got injured, and came back and looked like that, that may be a sign that eccentrically there's actually some fear or some avoidance of attacking the velocity in a downward direction. So the other thing to show is when you get variety like this, so if you don't coach intent, not to look at the variables too much, but if you just check out the CV, so the variation in the values themselves, when they're this high, it's very difficult to make any meaningful decisions. So I think this is going to be hammered on a little later as well, is that to get really solid decision making, you want those CVs to be nice and low, because you know what you're seeing is actually change and not just noise from jump to jump differences. Now, if we did one more in here, so actually let's just look at this. So what do we see? I think we see 3%. Oh, we got a 0.1. But so concentric stuff actually has already shown up. So now if Daniel hop back on.
Drew, just back on that eccentric strategy. Have you ever used any like eccentric variables to flag what might be a bad jump? You know, like here's a little flag, like go in and look at this raw data.
We've looked at eccentric peak velocity. So if there's something that's abnormally off, I think that would flag it. So I have a hard time giving like a stringent number, and more like a number from athletes' history. So like if I saw an athlete jump a certain way for a certain amount of time and then it was like a standard deviation away, that's more of a flag than just it's not this fast.
But if you had to pick one or a couple, you'd say eccentric peak velocity. Would you throw in any eccentric durations? I'm talking about like say you collect 10 guys in 20 minutes.
Right, and you want to make a quick like.
Yeah, like maybe you want to go back and say, okay, like what's all this data from quality? Is there anything you can like flags that for you to dive deeper into that jump and just check it out?
I'm actually going to let one of you guys answer that. I wouldn't feel comfortable that quickly because I would have to look at it and I would want to know if it was a change or just a bad jump. So like if one stood out, but if you did 4 or 5 trials and I saw one, I might throw it out. So like if eccentric duration or velocity was off, standard deviation is kind of typically 20%, whatever, then I would cut that trial. But from a testing group as a whole, I'd be fairly nervous until I compared it against things.
Yeah, I mean, I use the term from Dr. Sands of characteristic but idiosyncratic. Like it's characteristic of an athlete individually, but across the board, like, and I'll show some examples of people who represent eccentric very differently.
Anything else? That was good. But so if we kind of so if he hops back on, you want to hop back on and just give 3 good jumps, just like you were testing. So if he attacks his jumps as if he was lifting a max weight and everything's tested at what he can actually do, what we see is all of those CVs just drop like, what, 70, 80% on some, hundreds of a percent, I think, on others. But you can see just the intent and the actual ability to do what you can do makes the data meaningful. So I think that's just a big key thing to focus in on. Any questions? That make sense? You're pretty symmetrical or a pretty consistent man. And then the last thing, I guess, for those, even if you have used the system, some people don't realize that forced X jump exists, and they don't realize what forced X jump is. So it's an awesome testing platform. So if forced X is like your athlete hub, forced X jump is like your group testing or your mass testing hub. So what we can do here, there's a couple options. So if we just did one person jumping, one of the cool things is everything's automated. We going again? I don't think we have any takers. So now everything's automated. He can stand on. As a coach, I can step away. So if he just stays still enough, the system is set very strictly. We got it, so he's got his weight in, and now he's free to do any jump type he wants. So he can go counter movement jump. Go ahead, we'll do 2. So it'll spit back feedback in real time. So now what he just did is displayed. So if he does this jump and I pause it, you'll see some 3 dials pop up. If he had historical data, these same little dials would populate the inside. So it'd be a historical data versus today's thing. So you could actually compare almost immediately against things you've chosen. So we could swap all these charts, change the way the charts look. But the point is, within the same recording, if we unpause it, he could go to a single leg jump, and he could just go, like a right leg single leg jump or whatever. And so if you had a protocol of 2 counter movement jumps, a single leg jump on each leg, and just 1 squat jump. So then if we pause that or stop it, so now you've got a whole battery of tests done in a matter of, 45 seconds? And we could save that back to his profile and then go check that out. But so again, you're seeing the best. Oh, that got a CMJD.
Yeah. Just a slight.
So the cool thing is you can change it. So if it was a squat jump, I can change that. You might not want to because there's a counter movement, but in any case. So the idea with this is you're getting the same information, you're just getting it faster. Not to belabor this. But if we threw it away, the last thing I'll show is for, again, people that don't know, is now, we have multiple platforms set up. We could theoretically connect them all to this computer and test 3 people at the same time. But what's, I think, more frequent now is to have a shared platform. So now if there's one person, who else can I test in here? That means you're coming up. So now we've got 2 panels, so 2 people ready to test on that one set of platforms. So again, it's automated, so once I hit way start, if Daniel hops in there, we'll just do 1 jump. We're not gonna, yeah. Just stand on it, we'll do a counter movement. So get your weight. So same thing, it's gonna snag that, boom, and now he can do his jumps, but we'll just do 1. And then he could step off. I'll switch the panels, Laurie will hop on, take his weight.
I don't think it's calibrated right, the weight's a bit high.
Hold on. All right, so he's got his weight, and then he just does his 1 jump. Gets his score, I pause it. Now, we could keep going. There could be 4, it could be 5, and we could rattle through, say, 3 counter movement jumps. Daniel, 3, Laurie, 3 jumps me, and then we could circle back around, and Daniel could do squat jumps, squat jumps, squat jumps. So you get some inherent built-in rest, and the group kind of keeps moving. You get a good group of tests done.
I think it's good to show, like, just click back on Daniel. You can just start Daniel again really, really quickly. Like it's.
How many can you queue up at once?
So like the Daniel's 4 straights, he starts going again.
So I've done as many as 10, but like the chance of something happening when you're scrolling through 10 athletes, it gets messy. I stick with 4 usually. Yeah, so then we just bounce back to Daniel. Daniel does his jump.
Yeah. You click
I click Laurie, he can go, and then it's just his turn. And so then if I stopped that and I went to go save, I'd save those jumps to their profiles and just kind of move on.
Dr. Cohen?
Just to say, the question about the number, it can go up very high. And I think the problem you mentioned is the scrolling.
Scrolling gets complicated.
So there is an update going to be coming where it's all on one screen. So you have little dots, little squares, and you get the athletes live.
So
Like the first one is always taking up the whole screen, and then you just click on it. So you could set up the 15 or 20, and you just.
and then the athlete will look like the CMJ box, yeah? Up in the top here.
And then there'll be V0, that's the other concern.
Yeah.
20 minutes and you never V0, but that would be.
One of the other solutions is probably just buy like a lot more force plates.
But yeah, I think that's it for me.
So one of the questions I had is, I know there's a lot of, it's probably for you, Drew, or for anyone. So there's a lot of queuing on how to jump. I don't hear a lot of discussion around how to land. Like, how are you just wanting them to land, how to naturally land because you want to actually see that, or is there a queuing on the landing, or is that just more of a rehab kind of discussion?
Yeah, so I've heard both. Like let's just see how someone lands. I would coach it from the get-go because I think there's no reason not to. There's no reason to expose someone to forces they shouldn't be exposed to, regardless. But I've heard some good arguments to see like how someone lands in the wild and how they cope with sort of impact. But for me, it's like, okay, I'm going to squat with 300 pounds. I just want to see how you do it and see what your back can tolerate, just cause. But so I look at it the same way. Like if you're going to land with like a good intent, good form, good technique, because I can coach that. So.
Cool. Well.
Yeah.
What are some ways that you measure the limbs for the testing?
So it's a good question. So that picture, do you remember the isometric? So like Daniel stood on the platforms, I would have someone lay on the ground, place their arm on the platform, and just sort of relax.
I can do it if you want.
Yeah, so like at home, yeah, like actually let's just do this. No, because we'll just, you can lay on your back too to throw your leg up there if you want. So like if you were doing a hamstring test and we had it up on a box, we would just get them in there. So what I would do is, since the Pascos have this nice little circle, I would actually get his foot on that circle so that every single time it's the same. The reason being is that if we have things moving around, there's going to be more weight, less weight. And so I just like to keep it the same, and the length of the limb will be the same. So that's just me. Like at my house, I've got a little mark on my platforms like these, and I've just put a little dab that's like 8 inches in, and so that's just where I go. Same thing when I do a plyo push-up. So the idea, I actually didn't talk about it too much, but the issue with the plyo push-up is the whole system isn't covered in the platform. So since half your body's hanging off the platform, if I push myself backwards and more weight shifts towards my foot, the platform doesn't account for that. So you lose. So if we had a third platform under the feet, you'd account for the whole system mass. So you see what I'm saying? So like if someone started here and then did a plyo push-up and started here and their foot moved back, they're now 20 kilos lighter. So all of the data changes.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So first of all, if you have someone to do a squat jump, is there like a recommended time that you get them to hold the squat for? Because I've seen some stuff that can influence a lot.
So yeah, I do 3 seconds, and I always say ready, set, go, because when I do that, for some reason, it's like they're like a deer in headlights and they're like frozen. So I do instead of counting and they're kind of like ready, I just say ready, set, go.
Have you seen like if say like 3 or 6 seconds, it's a huge amount of difference?
I haven't seen a big enough difference to matter. The 3 second hold for me is, yeah. But again, like I'm totally open if you disagree.
There's some ways that you can tighten it up pretty easily. Like if you're open to using a dowel, and depending on what the environment is, you have a rack. What you can do is set it at the height you want, and have them pin the dowel against the rack, and then take off from there on a verbal instruction too. Something like that, just to create something that also you get people who,
some tactile stuff.
yeah. So it depends.
Another question I have is, have you ever done, so talking about the intent, getting them to try and do it, get a good maximal, so that then when you come back to it, you can tell that that's really how they were really trying. So have you ever done anything like, maybe hung something above the platform, like a rim or something, to make it into like a competition?
It's like who can touch it?
Yeah.
I haven't. I haven't seen anyone do it either, but that's not a bad idea. I don't know if you've, has anyone seen that?
They do that in the NBA combine, they put
Something up there?
things above them. The issue is that then you create asymmetry if you're touching hands.
Oh, if you're swinging. So what, but like if I was thinking like put a ball up there and just see who can touch it with their head, hands on hips. I don't mind that, that's cool.
And then last thing really, just about footwear considerations as well, just wonder if because depending on how spongy things that might change something like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be worried. I just want athletic shoes for me. Same.
Because I saw a difference when I was, sparring at the NFL Combine. Guys that had thicker heels, their load was greater. So I wonder if their RFD would be greater, thicker heel shoe. Like I say, a platform shoe, lifting shoe versus that. Now, obviously, we won't want to lift and jump in the platform shoe.
Right. Oh, you're talking like an Olympic lifting shoe, like.
Yeah, but they had shoes at the NFL Combine. They were thick, like 2 inches thick, as opposed to other shoes that were thinner.
So I guess if it deformed more as you going down, it might affect that.
Yeah, I mean, my brain goes to if someone wants to wear a 2-inch thick shoe, they're there's something they don't like, so they're probably just going to shallow out. And if they shallow out, their RFD is going to.
Yeah, it's more so like you get them in 1 week and they come in next week and they're wearing
Like something randomly different.
They're wearing
Yeah, I wouldn't be that worried. I think the forces are too high to have that distorted enough.
Quick question about the surface underneath the plates. So we have a floor pretty similar to this, or if I move the plates down to the weight room that has more of like the soft weight room floor, or now we have our plates on top of a Kaiser mid-thigh pull rack where it's a steel surface. Do I need to be concerned, especially on landing, that I'm causing more noise on the landing force because of extra vibration of being on metal versus concrete? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend on the metal. I think I saw that with a Kairos rack once, and someone just stuffed something underneath it because when they left the platform, there was a trail.
Right.
God, it's hard to know. Like the one that gets me is if the spongy floor is actually like you can push your thumb into it. Then I would look to see maybe.
So with the Kairos setup, would you put maybe even just like a towel?
Yeah, so the Kairos, from what I remember, at least last time, has like a rod and a rod. So there's like 4 holes, and they just stuck towels under there. Or like a mat. Something just to stop it from being nothing.
Is there a quick and dirty way to, if you know your body mass well and you stand on there, is that going to, how much force to put through there before we can tell if the floor's making you?
I think it would be on landing. Like you'd need to jack the force up pretty high, right? To see anything from a spongy floor. It would have to be pretty aggressive.
I mean, if the things like the flooring, if it's really bad, in flight time, you'll see.
Yeah, you'll see it wave, yeah.
So if you look at the trace, you know, it's one of the weaknesses in the body.
Right. Yeah.
Is there a particular threshold for body weight when you're looking at left and right force plates? I know you said something like 2 kilos.
No, so the example was a 2 kilo athlete. I put in a body weight 2 kilos heavier than they were, and it affected the data that much. The typical thing, if you're weighing an athlete, you want to see the oscillation be like at 0.1 newtons. And then the left-right stuff, like if you got, I mean, that's just how someone stands. It could be a sign that the platforms are on an uneven surface. But if I'm standing 60% on my right leg, that's not something you would need to correct for in terms of like, no, stand more on your left leg, right? Yeah. So is that what you're asking? Yeah, okay.
And if you want to check the floor, you can just turn around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so like if you see 60 or 70% or something like this, and then you flip around and it just switches legs, that would be a sign that it's the floor leaning.
So would you have the individual, like, say the floor is level, would you have them stand on the left with 2 bilateral and on the right?
No, so like if I was standing here and I had 60% of my weight on my right leg, and then I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna stand like this, and now there's 60% on the same platform, but now it's my left leg, that would just show me that it's the platform, not me. Cool.
Well,
Awesome.
thank you, Drew.
Yeah.